Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in to the Summit County TV special on forest management in the wake of the mountain pine beetle epidemic. We have with us today Ross Wilmore with the U.S. Forest Service and Dan Gibbs, Summit County Commissioner. They're here to discuss wildfire risks associated with the mountain pine beetle epidemic here in the county. Thanks for joining us today, fellows.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks. So to start off with, could you maybe walk us through the risks that are inherent with the mountain pine beetle epidemic? Could you discuss that for the viewers at home?
Absolutely. Lodgepole pine goes through some distinctive periods of fire hazard throughout the course of individual stands' lifespans. For a long period during kind of their middle age, if you will, we often refer to them as asbestos forests because they just don't lend themselves to fire very readily. They're right underneath the forest is very tightly compacted needles. You've got canopies that are very high in the trees. There's no vegetation that's burnable between the surface and the canopies, and so really not much happens fire-wise for many decades actually in the middle of their lifespan. But as things begin to change and we have a disturbance event of some kind, in this case it was the mountain pine beetle, come into the lodgepole pine and begin to kill the trees, what happened then was the needles of course began to turn red and begin to fall. And what that allows is a lot of sunshine onto the forest floor, and also because the trees are dying, there isn't as much competition for other forms of vegetation for resources in the soil, because the lodgepole pine is pretty much taking everything that there is. So what begins to happen is the surface begins to change. A lot's been made about the red needles, and the red needles in the canopy is certainly a part of the story. But from a fire perspective, it's all what's happening on the surface. So here's a great example of what we're talking about. There's some grass growing here. There's grass that's moving from open areas into the forest. And what that does is it provides a new, very continuous, fine, what we call fuel bed that can move into the forest. And the second thing that happens is that once the trees start to die, they start to topple over. We've got a pretty good example here what a jackstraw area looks like. These kind of areas of jackstraw along with the continuous fuel bed significantly changes the fire hazard. So you can get a fire that starts in a fine area, would move through these fine fuels into a heavier jackpot, and then move out of that jackpot through fine fuels into another jackpot, and so on and so on and so on. Now the other thing that can happen is because you will have a fire of increased intensity, that will still allow for a crown fire even after many of the red needles have fallen off the trees. The reason being is because we do have a lot of dead gray stage lodgepole pine, but not all the trees are dead. And contrary to some popular belief, a green crown in a lodgepole will burn not quite as readily as a red crown, but it'll still burn pretty easily. So we could have an intense fire on the surface, will drive fire into the crowns, it'll move through green crowns and gray stage lodgepole pine, and you still lend yourself to a high fire event. Now certainly in red needle situations you can have some pretty spectacular fire, but without these surface fuels to drive it, I have actually seen fire go into a red stage stand and stop because there was nothing on the surface to sustain the crown fire. So you have to have intense surface fire before you can have crown fire. Now the second problem, of course, is what happens after the fire. If you have an area here where you've got some really heavy concentrations, what happens is a fire will get in there, it'll burn very intensely, and it'll also burn for a long time. And what that does is it cooks the soil, all of the microbes that are in there that help with regeneration after a fire, turns the soil very fine, and that allows it later on to be much more susceptible to erosion. That kind of soil will flow down into creeks and rivers and stuff and can be very damaging to watersheds. And because the soil has been so damaged by heat, it takes quite a long time for those kinds of areas to regenerate.
Great. Thank you, Ross. Dan, would you like to add something?
We've seen examples throughout Colorado, in particular the Hayman fire that burned in 2002, burned over 132,000 acres, where the fuels were so intense, and still today the regen has been awfully slow. Whereas Ross mentioned, the soil has been extremely cooked. It's created erosion impacts that really have impacted water. Denver Water has spent millions of dollars dealing with sediment control on the aftermath. And when we look at Summit County's landscape, we're one big watershed when you look at it. And so we're seeing some examples of Summit County having over 1,000 stems of lodgepole pine per acre. And then, as Ross mentioned too, having this potential jackstraw effect, potential fire would have a lot of intensity, to say the least, and would really be out of control depending on relative humidity and the winds that may occur. And so we've been trying to be very proactive, working with the county, U.S. Forest Service, to be very strategic on where the thinning takes place in our community.
You know, I've witnessed a number of folks throughout the county who are doing fuels treatments, kind of creating a buffer space around their homes to better improve, protect their homes from the threat of wildfire. And among these people, I've also heard questions about the need for these larger forest health projects in light of their efforts and HOA efforts in their own neighborhoods to improve or reduce wildfire threat in their neighborhoods. Could you maybe address those concerns or that issue?
Yeah, sure, Troy. Defensible space is very important, to say the least. And through the grant program that we have administered through the Summit County Wildfire Council and pass-through voters, which were approved with 1A funds, we're able to offer real money to help citizens help pay for defensible space around their home. So we've spent thousands of dollars and we've treated thousands of acres as a result of that. And we're having really great programs in place in our community, but defensible space doesn't cut it by itself. That's why we've worked cooperatively with U.S. Forest Service and a lot of our other partners. Back in 2005, we adopted our Community Wildfire Protection Plan, and that really helped create the blueprint for our community to look at what areas with limited funds that we could treat on a case-by-case basis. So we have our focus areas, and so we all try to look at our map of Summit County, and we have all the towns are a partner, the U.S. Forest Service, the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control, the Colorado State Forest Service, Denver Water's a participant, Xcel Energy at times, and all three fire protection districts in Summit County. So we all try to be on the same page in terms of, with again, limited resources, what areas in the county are most in need of thinning. And so we've had some great successes, and defensible space for a particular home is wonderful to have, but when you look at a landscape scale, and we currently have 155,000 acres of dead trees as a result of these little mountain pine beetles. They're extremely small, but the beetle epidemic has really moved to the northeast, and now we're dealing with the aftermath, and that's why a real targeted, cooperative really agreements and working together on specific areas can make a huge impact in our community to really decrease the fire hazards in our area. U.S. Forest Service has worked a lot on fuel breaks around our community. I recognize the fact that sometimes it doesn't look all that appealing right away, but I can guarantee you, the aftermath of a wildfire, the regeneration that would occur in an area is much slower than being proactive in a particular area that will decrease the amount of fuels that we have in an area. We have amazing firefighters in our community, and if we do have a major fire here, we would have folks from all over the state, potentially all over the country, that would come to assist us. But we all know tourism plays a really important role in our economy, and we're really working hard to be proactive instead of reactive with potential fires that we have in our community. A lot of people don't know this, but we have an average of about 20 to 30, sometimes as many as 45 wildfire incidents in our community every year. And a lot of people only remember the larger ones, like in 2005 with the Ophir Mountain Fire, 2011 Keystone Gulch Fire. But we have a lot of smaller incidents that firefighters jump on top of right away to help remedy that particular fire. It's through great partnerships with Ross and other community members and so forth that we're able to achieve a lot.
The point that Dan made about defensible spaces is a really important one for us. It's very critical that homeowners work around their houses to make them as resilient to fire as possible. But it's important that we do understand that those areas by themselves won't necessarily do the job. Now, they provide a very good, safe, much safer place for firefighters to work, but you still don't want a highly intense forest fire just coming straight into those community protection zones and defensible spaces with that kind of intensity. It's a difficult problem to deal with. So what we like to do is go further outside of areas that have been treated for defensible space and continue to work a little further out so that if a fire does come in, it'll come into areas that we have treated, begin to diminish in intensity before they get near the defensible space that folks have worked on, and it makes it so much easier and so much safer for firefighters to deal with the problem.
Certainly, certainly. Well, thank you very much, Ross. Thank you, Dan, for coming
You
out
betcha.
today. That's very, very helpful information for our viewers at home with respect to reducing fire risk and hazard around the house. We're going to take a short break, but stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to discuss potential threats to wildlife and recreation with respect to the pine beetle infestation here in the forest.